to facilitate an international conversation about what is enough. And that if there is a number that is enough, there is a number that is too much. We believe that money becomes power, and when power threatens your democracy, you have to take away power, and the only way to take away that power is by taking away the money. And the only way to take away the money is taxation.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. This is a program that's going to astonish you, engross you, and energize you.
That's right, Ralph. Our first guest today is Erica Payne, founder and president of Patriotic Millionaires, an organization of high net worth individuals that says, hey, tax us more. You're not taxing us enough. Yes, there are people out there who have money, who aren't hoarding, who know when they have enough, and who, for the good of the country that made them rich, are willing to pay their fair share. Patriotic Millionaires' latest project is America 250, the Money Agenda, a framework that they say will permanently stabilize the economic lives of working people, stimulate widespread economic growth, and ensure prosperity and stability for America's next 250 years. We'll speak to Erica Payne about America 250, as well as Patriotic Millionaires' recent How to Beat the Oligarchs conference. In the second half of the program, we turn to our resident constitutional expert, Bruce Fein, who, along with Ralph, has written a letter detailing 22 counts of impeachment against Trump. It's up to 22 now. And as always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhyber. But first, yes, there are wealthy people out there who think longer term than just the next quarterly report. David?
Erica Payne is the founder and president of Patriotic Millionaires, an organization of high net worth individuals who aim to restructure America's political economy to suit the needs of all Americans. Their work includes advocating for a highly progressive tax system, a livable minimum wage, and equal political representation for all citizens. She is the co-author with Morris Pearl of Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Erica Payne.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Welcome back indeed, Erica. And listeners should know that book, Tax the Rich, has all the arguments you could possibly have to make the case with anybody, legislators, friends, neighbors, doubtful relatives, business executives. So pick it up, Tax the Rich. Having said that, Erica, introduce Patriotic Millionaires to our listeners.
Sure. So Patriotic Millionaires first came together in 2010. It was during the lame duck session of Congress when it became clear that President Obama was going to cave to Republican demands to extend the Bush tax cuts. And it really infuriated me that here is Mr. Hopey Changey coming in, and the first thing he can think of to do is to give tax cuts to a bunch of millionaires. So I work in politics. As it turns out, if you work in politics, you know a whole bunch of millionaires. And so I called a couple of them, and we drafted a really short letter that basically said, for the good of the country, raise my taxes. And we got about 56 millionaires to sign the letter. I called them Patriotic Millionaires for a very, very specific reason, which is conservatives have been telling a story for a long time, which is it's your money, you made it all by yourself, and now the government is stealing it and giving it to undeserving poor people who are probably Black. There's a racist undertone to their tax ideology. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about how to structure a society and economy. And so I wanted to reassert that paying taxes is fundamentally part of your patriotic duty. And it's embarrassing to all of us for people to bitch about it as much as they do, particularly people who have the level of resources that the people who complain about taxes the most have. And so over time, we have built a university. We started with this very small, specific thing. Do not extend the Bush tax cuts for incomes over $1 million. We achieved that. President Obama was very unhappy with us for about a year when we shut down the White House phone lines and constantly challenged him and his administration and the media to do the right thing. They eventually changed their mind and did the right thing. And so with that small victory in hand, this group of millionaires said, what is really wrong with the country that a small group of committed millionaires could have some positive effect on? And what we concluded is that essentially the economy of the United States is structured in such a way to guarantee that we will become more unequal more quickly over time. We are already at the highest levels of inequality in human history. We have created a game of economic Jenga where you pull from the bottom, pull from the middle, load all of those resources on the top, and the whole thing's about to come tumbling down. What we saw on January 20th, I believe, was the result of a global oligarchical coup who just took the queen on the chessboard. When you've got three people whose combined worth is around $1 trillion standing behind who is an unethical, at least criminal at worst, billionaire president, Houston, we have a problem here. And the problem is not actually Donald Trump. The problem is the preconditions that led to the rise of a vulnerability to an authoritarian leader and an oligarchy. And that vulnerability was brought about by the actions of both parties over decades.
This is quite extraordinary, listeners. You have rich people organizing, not just bloviating, organizing, lobbying Congress, other parliaments, saying they're undertaxed, that rich people all over are undertaxed, and they've got to be taxed more. And the principle of progressive taxation, which is over 100 years old in our country, has to be reinstated in order to block the escape hatches, the loopholes, the porous nature of the present perforated federal income tax. So let's go to your agenda.
Our work is in service to a single idea, which is you have to have a greater level of equality to save yourself from the threat of oligarchy and authoritarianism. So the inequality has to be dealt with in a few different ways. The two things that will fix inequality are raising the wage floor and taxing the rich. That is it. You cannot address this problem in any other way. Think of wages and taxes as the bookends of a strong economy. They are what holds the whole society together. So the goal of the Patriotic Millionaires legislative program is to ensure we're never going to be totally equal. We don't need to be totally equal. But what we need to do is make sure that everybody feels like there's an opportunity in our society. And we need to make sure that the rich people don't have so much money that it turns into power and they destroy our democracy. So we need to raise the wage floor to something that a human being can actually live on. And then we need to look at taxes, Ralph, in a very different way than people have historically looked at taxes. How the left likes to look at taxes is how you get money to pay for stuff. And getting money to pay for stuff is the purpose of taxes on the state and local level. On the federal level, we approach taxes very differently. We say concentrated wealth is the threat to democracy. The only way to break up concentrated wealth is through taxation. So when we do our tax work on the federal level, we really look at that as democracy preservation work, as opposed to us going to get some more revenues to pay for various things that the society needs. So, and our members do not take opinions on how the government spends its money. We just want to make sure that the extent to which we need tax revenues to support the financing of programs that people like our members pay for substantially more than that. But the bigger exercise therein is how do we preserve our democracy for the long term? And can you actually have a democracy when one person has $1 trillion and spends it to buy your political system?
Erica, let's talk numbers here. First of all, remind our listeners what the tax rates are now for ordinary income, capital gains, and so forth as a background. And then we'll talk about what you would like to see occur.
Okay, so as a background, here are a few things that people should understand. First is if you make money working and a millionaire makes money clicking a button and selling some stock on an E-Trade account, you will pay more in taxes on the work income that you make than a rich person will on the income they make off of money. That's the difference between what's called ordinary income and capital gains income. In the tax code as it exists right now, number one, capital gains is taxed at about half the rate of ordinary income. So people who make money off of their money pay half the tax rate of people who make money off of their work. And what that means over time is that every single dollar a rich person makes is actually worth more money than every dollar a poor person makes. So you see what I'm talking about with this mathematical inequality. When the dollar that every rich person makes is more valuable than the dollar that every working person makes, over time, mathematically, you become more unequal, even if the people are making the same amount of money. So if our millionaires are making $100,000 a year selling stock and a working stiff is making $100,000 a year working, the working person will pay about $9,000 more in taxes than the person who makes their money off of capital gains. That's a big difference.
And this was too draconian even for Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan wanted capital gains to be taxed at the rate of ordinary income. And listeners, after World War II, the maximum tax rate on the rich reached 90%, and it was 70%, it was 50%, it went down under Reagan, and now it's about 21% on capital gains, as Erica pointed out, and a maximum on ordinary income about 37 or so percent. And what Trump wants to do is lower the tax rate, mostly on the super rich and the multinational corporations, ramming it through Congress in the next month or so. So what would you do about the inequality, which is the umbrella of your agenda, of course, and its effect on weakening a democratic society? Let's talk about your cost of living exemption.
Yeah, so we have a 4-part proposal to fix the economy of the United States for the long term so that we can sustain our society in a way that people want to live. So number one, we are working right now to introduce a piece of legislation that will eliminate the federal income tax obligation of people up to the cost of living and to shift those lost revenues to people who make more than $1 million a year, with a 3% surtax on incomes over $1 million a year and an 8% surtax on incomes over $10 million a year. If we do those two surtaxes, we will more than cover the lost revenue from giving people up to the cost of living a tax cut. And so right now in America, there's a great tool. It's called the MIT Living Wage Calculator, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. You can Google it. You can go on there and you can look for the cost of living in any state, any city, any locality in the entire country. We suggest that we look at the median cost of living in the country, which is $48,000. By way of illustration, this offers a working person about $10 per day for food. Okay, so that's not highfalutin money. We believe that we should give all of those folks a tax cut. We're going to leave Social Security and Medicare contributions in place because we want those programs to remain really strong. But we are going to get rid of that income tax for the rest of up to $48,000, with the idea being, first, you got to support yourself. And once you can support yourself, then you can contribute to the federal coffers. And because every side seems to bitch about deficits if the other side is trying to spend money, in order to deal with the revenue argument, we've shifted all of those revenues to people north of $1 million. So again, very simple idea. People who make more than $1 million a year pay a little bit more on that first dollar after their first million, 3%. If you make 10 million, you pay a little bit more on that first dollar after your first 10 million, you pay 8%. And if we do that, we can eliminate the federal tax burden on working people up to the cost of living so that Donald Trump's tax code is no longer taxing working people into poverty. That's the first step. And I think we're going to have that bill introduced here, Ralph, in probably the next couple of weeks. And we are right now working very hard to get people to sign up to show their support for that policy. So if somebody wants to go to costoflivingexemption.com, they can sign up there to show they support that. And what we will translate that into is a really active outreach to lawmakers to demand that they support this policy.
Give that website again, please.
Costoflivingexemption.com. You can also go to patrioticmillionaires.org and you'll see all of this on our website. But we've got 3 more steps that come after that. So to me, Ralph, this is the easy one. If you're looking a lawmaker in the face and you're saying to them, I'm making 45 grand a year, I'm working my tushy off, and the federal government is currently taxing me into poverty, I think that I need to be able to take care of myself. First, can you have those multimillionaires pick up the difference until I can support myself? I think most politicians should say yes. And a politician who will say no is not a politician we want in office, regardless of what political party they're in. So this is the first step, the cost of living exemption. There are some steps that come after that. Number two, we want a cost of living wage. So as I said, right now, the median cost of living in the country is $48,000 a year, $10 a day for food. It gives you about $800 a month for rent. Very modest living. So let's make sure that when people work full time, they can actually support themselves. And the only way to do that is to raise wages. The federal wage floor, which is how you should think about it, the minimum wage, the wage floor, the floor that we all stand on, is $7.25 an hour. And it's $2.13 an hour for tipped workers like waiters and waitresses. Now, that's what it was when I was in college. I am currently 55 years old. Okay. That is weird and not good. So the cost of living is around $22 an hour. 40% of people in the country make less than what it costs to support a single adult with no children, that $48,000 number. What we would like to see is the wage floor, the minimum wage, to see it raised to the cost of living for a single adult with no children. So that people, if you walk into a job and you work 40 hours, you can support yourself in a modest scale of living. That requires changing that wage floor to about $22 an hour. That's step number two. Now, step number three, Ralph, which is what we just talked about, is this differentiation between people who make money off their money and people who make money off of their sweat. The third proposal
Erica.
is to equalize all tax rates for all money, inheritance, capital gains, and ordinary income over $1 million. The Equal Tax Act. Why is your money any more valuable than mine? And then the fourth piece is to deal with the gigantic donut hole in the middle of the tax code, which is the fact that we do not currently tax wealth. So if you own a home, you pay a property tax. If Jeff Bezos owns 10 yachts, he does not pay a property tax. So our goal is to make sure that the very wealthiest pay taxes on their wealth and on the growth of their wealth and on the money they leave to their children.
What about the argument that wealth is now very, very fluid, can be transported instantly in terms of stocks and other assets outside the jurisdiction of the U.S. into some tax haven? And it's a very difficult task to tax that kind of wealth in contrast to ownership of land or buildings in the U.S. Can you address that?
Yes. So first of all, we don't decide not to do things because they are difficult. Okay. That's number one. Number two, people are hiding their money all over the globe. So what we need is an international tax system. Ralph, I just spoke at the IMF and I called for three things: a global asset registry, a conversation about what is enough, and a commitment to taxing people in order to make them less rich. You are correct. People are hiding their money. We can pass laws that require them to not hide their money and to pay taxes on it.
You talked largely on income tax. Where are you on sales tax of stock transactions, imposing sales tax disproportionately owned by the rich?
Well, this is an issue of how are you going to tax stock buybacks? And we've spent a lot of time in our organization talking about stock buybacks. They basically, it's when the executives of a company have the company spend its money to purchase the stock to make the stock price go up artificially. And that there has been a proposal to increase taxes on stock buybacks, I think from 1% to 4%. Taxing big corporations 4% on stock buybacks that deliver money directly into the pockets of their executives is not a good policy. It is not going to fix the problem. A better policy would be to either ban stock buybacks or limit them significantly.
Which, of course, listeners, stock buybacks were largely banned until Reagan took over because the Securities and Exchange Commission thought stock buybacks expanded the opportunity for stock manipulation unfairly. So this is something that started in 1981. Well, Bob McIntyre, who for many years headed the Citizens for Tax Justice before he retired, had said that if the tax rates that were enforced in the 1960s were operating today, there'd be no deficit. And the 1960s were quite prosperous comparatively. So we're not talking pie in the sky, listeners, at all here. We're talking about often going back into the future by seeing how it was years ago before the corporations and their corporate tax attorneys began to make Swiss cheese out of our federal income tax. Let's get on the tax on wealth. Saul Price, who founded the Price Club, which then merged to Costco, he lobbied Congress, and he was very rich. He lobbied Congress for a 1% wealth tax, and the Democrats ignored him. So let's talk about Capitol Hill now. Where is the ranking member of the House Ways and Means Committee, who comes from Western Massachusetts, and his name is Richard Neal? Is he supporting you?
So Richie Neal got very pissed off at us when we called for him to resign from Congress and be investigated by the Ethics Committee for some unseemly and clearly questionable enormous payments that were made to his son Brendan for lobbying on issues that he had no expertise in a clear indication that it was actually hiding lobbying to try to curry favor with his father's committee. So Richie Neal, surprisingly, will not call Patriotic Millionaires back or take a meeting. So it is not clear to me what he thinks of our agenda. It is clear to me that his son is unhappy with us calling out his ethics and his father's ethics because he confronted me at a party on Saturday night. And so that was kind of an interesting exchange. I think Richie Neal needs to resign. Richie Neal is 78 years old. He's been a corporate shill for the entirety of his political career. And if he has a change of heart now, seeing like what he has done that has facilitated an oligarchy, I think theoretically you always want to believe in redemption. So if he wants to stay in office, prove yourself redeemed and start making some big time noise about what these rich folks have gotten away with for all of these years.
Well, let's look at someone who is on your side, Congressman Lloyd Doggett from the Austin, Texas area, former
he's great.
member of the Texas Supreme Court, and Ron Wyden, who's the ranking minority member of the Senate Finance. Are they with you on the program?
Yeah, they love us. We love them. Those are two great lawmakers. So, yes.
And are you trying to get an informal hearing, the way Congress Watch is, of public citizen, so the Democrats can take a committee room, have great witnesses, the press there? They don't have to wait for the Republicans. It would be what's called a shadow hearing. And they've had 3 or 4 of them already. Elizabeth Warren had one on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that's being destroyed by Trump as we speak. And she got some good press. Are you pushing for shadow hearings to balance the closeout of any dissent as the Republicans try to ram through Trump's tax cuts in the next few weeks?
We have not called for a shadow hearing, but I think that that's a great tactic and something we should explore. Thanks for the idea.
That's very important. And how about back home? You travel a lot, and are you getting enthusiasm? Or do you get people who sort of throw their hands up in the air and say it's too complex to understand tax reform?
Here's the thing. Taxes are not that hard to understand, first of all. They make it hard on purpose. And so that's why we wrote this book, Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer. And so if you want to read the book, then you'll know everything you need to know, and it has cartoons, and it's funny, and it's super easy to understand. If you don't feel like reading the book, you can go to taxtherich.com, and there's a video that tells you everything you need to know about the tax code in 15 minutes. So there are 2 ways to have it not be confusing. I don't have anybody throwing their hands up. I have a whole bunch of people mad and ready to fight and ready to roll up their sleeves and do stuff. And I think, Ralph, one of the great things about this moment that we're having right now is that everything that we've been saying for years, we've been telling people we are in the middle of a global oligarchical coup for the better part of the tenure of this organization. People have not believed us, and not enough people have believed us. People woke up in November when he won, and then in January when you had that $1 trillion picture of all of the billionaires taking stage, and then seeing what Elon Musk has done since then, and they've woken up, and they're fighting.
I've always thought that people generally in the U.S. are more anti-tax than people in Western Europe and Canada, because in Western Europe and Canada, much more of the tax dollars come back to the people in the form of universal health insurance, in the form of all kinds of benefits, maternal, child care, paid family sick leave, and other public services. So in those countries, they feel they're getting their taxes coming back to them. Where in the U.S., a huge amount of taxes go to the military budget, bloated like you can't believe, and also into corporate welfare, handouts, subsidies, giveaways, bailouts, and corporate tax expenditures. Explain this phrase, corporate tax expenditures, for people.
A tax expenditure, which I think is a really weird way to talk about it. Again, this is like they make it confusing so people won't understand it. But tax expenditures is just basically another way of saying like money they spend through the tax code. So it's tax breaks for corporations. They're giving them money to create certain behaviors. But we have tax expenditures through the tax code for other things also. I mean, the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit are basically welfare benefits that are administered through the tax code. Those are tax expenditures. It is money being spent through the tax system in order to achieve certain outcomes. So there's nothing wrong with a tax expenditure. It's just that if I'm deciding to spend money through my tax code, I'm not particularly inclined to spend it on Nike. I'm more inclined to spend it on a kid who doesn't have enough to eat. Now, Nike, like 2 or 3 years in the last decade, has paid no taxes. Okay. That's why people who are making 20 grand a year are putting their money into the federal coffers.
Erica, I found one message that really works in front of audiences. You ask people, do you work for a big company? Well, some people raise their hands and say, yeah. And you find companies that these people work for who paid no federal income tax, like General Electric made billions of U.S.-based dollars in profit earlier this century, and not only paid no federal income tax, but got a refund. That so crazy is our tax system. So when you get someone in the audience saying, yeah, I work for a company, say like General Electric, and you say, well, did you know that you sent more dollars in actual dollars to the U.S. Treasury than your entire giant company that employs you, which sent nothing? Have you ever tried that approach?
We have tried that approach. I think where I usually do it is to say, who drives more on the roads? Amazon delivery people or you? Why are you paying more for the road than the Amazon delivery person? That's how I do it. But I think you're getting at the same basic idea.
Yeah. Well, let's go to Steve.
Erica, you did this. I noticed you did this conference called Beat the Broligarchs. And I noticed in the intro, one of the topics was the psychology of the extremely wealthy. What is the psychology of the extremely wealthy?
Well, it's basically the philosophy that I like to call it Fajigma. The philosophy of Fajigma is forget you, Jack, I got mine. And what seems to happen when people get rich, and this has been studied, academic studies have shown that when people achieve higher and higher levels of wealth, they become more selfish, they become more likely to break laws, they become more likely to behave in ways that are antisocial. There's a fantastic social psychologist named Paul Piff. Go check him out. He has done all of these studies about what happens when people get rich and how they behave. There are some interesting studies about people who drive nicer cars tend to run red lights and stop signs more than people who don't drive nice cars. Okay, he does a great study where a guy cheats at Monopoly, knows he's cheating at Monopoly. Everybody who's playing the game knows he's cheating at Monopoly. And still after the Monopoly game that he won, he's off in the corner bragging about how he won the game. So that's basically what happened. That's the disease that infects some rich people. And that disease is very problematic for all the rest of it, even though they're the people who caught it.
It seems to be grounded in some sense of I'm deserving, so I have these privileges.
It is undeserving and I have these privileges. And if you think about it, the richer you get, the more people you have to have around you to manage you and your stuff. And so all of those people are not going to be particularly inclined to tell you that you're full of it. And so you do understand how it would evolve. I mean, I'll say, I'm not sure if Ralph became a multimillionaire, would he still be a fabulous dude? I don't know the answer to that. Steve, I don't know the answer for any of us. But what we do know is that when people achieve levels of great wealth, they tend to act in ways that are problematic to our society. And that is when we have to intervene.
And by the way, the studies show that lower income people give a larger percentage of their income to charity than very rich people give to charity. There's a real parsimony of the plutocrats situation in our country where they're extremely miserly, with, of course, luminous exceptions.
this whole let's rely on charity, this is very interesting. So the senator from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, was at a Senate finance hearing the other day. And he said that basically if somebody needs help, they should go first to themselves and their families, second to their church or to charity, and third to the federal government. And that is their philosophy. Now, when I hear that, what that says to me is go first to your family, and then second, go to some entity that may or may not help you. And then third, go to the government. When I'm ordering my society, I would like for people to go first to their friends and family, second to the government, and third to charity. And the reason that I put it in that order is that I don't want the human needs to be optional. I don't want it to be reliant on the whims of a rich person to decide if they should fund a charity. What I would rather do is solve the problems in our society as a matter of a common exercise. So I don't want to walk down the street and have homeless people attack school children like someone did. A mentally ill homeless person attacked a group of teachers and children in Washington, D.C. I don't want it to be up to a charity to decide if that individual gets the help that they need to stop being a danger to society.
Very well said. I used to sum it up this way. A society that has more justice is a society that needs less charity. By the way, before we go to David, what's your take on Trump and the poisonous tusks of Elon Musk's attack on the Internal Revenue Service, their budget, firing thousands of personnel? What's your take on that? Are you taking a position?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the only position you can take is that if somebody is trying to increase government efficiency, the last thing you should cut is the one department in government that brings in revenue. Cutting the IRS costs the U.S. government money. If you ran a business, Ralph, would you ever fire your accounts receivable department? No, it would be the last department you would cut. So then it says he's either stupid because that's what he's cutting, which I think is probably inaccurate. So if he's not stupid, then why is he doing it? And he's doing it for the same reason that lawmakers have hacked at the IRS budget forever. They don't want their donors to get taxed. They don't want their donors to be audited. And so they cut the cops. So all these folks who are griping about Black Americans calling to defund the police are actually defunding the police that is keeping them in line and keeping them honest. And so I believe that the first police we should fund is the financial police, because the machinations of the richest people in the country are what are creating most of the preconditions that lead people to crime in the first place.
And the Republicans on Capitol Hill have led in slashing the IRS budget and supporting Trump's maraudings on the IRS today.
It was the first bill they took in. It's the very first bill that Republicans introduced when they took over the House was cutting the 80.
And the Democrats have not accused the Republicans of actively aiding tax evasion by the super rich and multinational corporations. That's how feeble that Democratic Party is. Let's go to David.
Thank you. I want to return to what you were just talking about, the order of love, because there was a theological dispute between Vice President J.D. Vance and Pope Francis this year, where J.D. Vance used the term ordo amoris, the order of love, and said, first you take care of yourself, then your family, and then if you have any love left over, give it to the rest of the world. And the Pope fired back at J.D. Vance that Jesus taught, no, you love most vulnerable. You don't start with yourself. You don't start with your family. You start with those most in need. So when you focus on billionaires, as much as I love to demonize them, how do we focus on the poor? How do we draw attention like Bobby Kennedy did in his last year, touring Appalachia and forcing the media to take pictures of children with distended bellies? How do we draw focus away from the lavish lifestyles of the billionaires and force a discussion about half this country that's struggling, dying, literally dying? How do we focus that energy less on the billionaires, more on the poor?
Well, I guess, David, for me, I would ask, like, where is the focus going to have the better chance of getting the outcome that we need. And the premise of the exercise of our organization is it's wages and taxes and the distribution of political power. Tax the rich, pay the people, spread the power. So when we do our work, it's very useful for us to amplify the egregious harm that some billionaires are doing to the planet and to working people, because then the answer to that is to make them less rich. I think sometimes in focusing, I think you can lose people's energy because there are so many poor people right now. I think people know people are suffering because they're the people suffering. I mean, we have 70% of people in the country right now who make less than the median cost of living for a single adult with children. So all of those people are aware of the suffering. I mean, what we've done when 8 Democrats joined with all of the Republicans to vote against raising wages to $15 an hour in the middle of a global pandemic, it pissed me off so badly at Democrats that I grabbed a bunch of my members. We did a road trip to Kentucky. We did a road trip to West Virginia. We stopped people in the Dollar General parking lot to talk to them about wages and taxes. And then ultimately, we started a program, an ongoing program. It's 3 years old in one of the poorest counties in North Carolina that is a deep red county, and one of the poorest counties in Wisconsin, which is a deep red county. And we went into both of those places, into Whiteville, North Carolina, and Richland Center, Wisconsin. And we've spent 3 years talking to working people / poor people across the political aisle in those 2 locations about how politicians of both parties have rigged the economy against them and the power that they have to fix it. So what I'd like to do is not highlight their plight as much as to amplify and enhance their power, because these folks actually have a huge amount of political power. And the county in North Carolina, for example, that I'm talking about is represented by the majority leader of the North Carolina House, Brendan Jones. He refuses to give a hearing to a minimum wage bill. The minimum wage in North Carolina is $7.25 an hour. We just had about 50 people go to Raleigh to lobby their lawmakers, including Brendan Jones, to raise wages. So I want to empower them rather than just show people, how tough their life is. I'd rather give them the tools they need to help them make their lives better. And that better life is going to come about with a higher wage floor. And that is a matter of law. I also think it's worth mentioning that this area that we're in North Carolina moved 12 points from Democrats to Republicans after Bill Clinton passed NAFTA. Okay. So I think that one of the things that the Democratic Party needs to do is hold up a mirror and admit to the role that they played in decimating America's middle class and working people in America.
You're quite right, Erica. They lost most of their furniture industry in North Carolina after NAFTA.
That's right.
Erica, before we conclude, I'd like to have the listeners find out whether they could get a visit from any of your group staff, like you went to North Carolina, around the country. What do they have to do to try to get a visit so they can rally people in their community?
Just send us an email at info@patrioticmillionaires.org. We have a series of presentations. We have members who will travel all over the country to present to small community groups, to large rallies. We have a few different presentations we do to spark conversation, and we'd love to come visit with community groups. So just drop us an email and let us know.
The nice thing about these visits, listeners, by the Patriotic Millionaires is they focus attention of the people in the assembly on the members of Congress, on the 2 senators and representatives from the district. So it isn't just riling them up and have the civic energy go into the ether. It's directed like a laser beam on the 535 members of Congress that can make these decisions for the people back home who've delegated their constitutional authority to these lawmakers who most of the time have turned their back on the people and represented a few hundred corporations instead. Any last point you want to make before we conclude, Erica Payne?
Absolutely. The cost of living exemption.com, I think, is one of the single most powerful pieces of legislation that has been put forth in recent memory. First, to deliver thousands, hundreds, if not thousands of dollars directly into the pockets of working people. It will have no cost to the federal government whatsoever, revenue neutral, and rich people won't feel it. At a divided moment in America, I think we can agree that the federal government shouldn't tax people into poverty, and to the extent necessary, rich people should pick up the difference. And so if you believe that, then please join our efforts for this specific piece of legislation and go to cost of living exemption and put your name on the list, and we will be in touch with you to let you know which lawmaker to call when and what you can do to best push this simple solution for a stable country.
If you need any added motivation, listeners, read the book Tax the Rich by Erica Payne and Morris Pearl. And connect. After all, patriotic millionaires and multimillionaires and a couple billionaires, they don't have the number of votes you have. So you have huge assets to amplify their progressive, humane, and constructive mission for a democracy that works for everybody. Thank you very much, Erica Payne.
Thanks so much, Ralph. This was fun. Thanks, Steve and David and Hannah.
We've been speaking with Erica Payne. We will link to Patriotic Millionaires at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we'll be joined by a resident constitutional expert, Bruce Fein, who's going to talk about the letter that he and Ralph sent to Trump outlining 22 articles of impeachment. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, May 2, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. In New York City last week, a group of legislators and citizens rallied at the New York Stock Exchange to demand the reinstatement of New York's stock transfer tax. The stock transfer tax, first enacted in 1905, places a nominal fee of 5 cents on stock sales over $20. Though small for individual trades, full collection of the tax could generate an estimated $14 billion to $16 billion annually for the state, revenue that would be used to fund public services. The stock transfer tax existed from 1905 to 1981. It raised billions for the state, yet Wall Street prospered. That's because the tax is so low. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. David, introduce our resident constitutional expert.
Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar and international law expert. Mr. Fein was Associate Deputy Attorney General under Ronald Reagan, and he is the author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, as well as American Empire Before the Fall. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted.
Yeah, welcome again, Bruce. You know, you have called Donald J. Trump the most impeachable president in American history, and you've backed it up by drafting 22 articles of impeachment based on his first 100 days, and more to come, it looks like. And tell us about the more important impeachment articles before we ask you what the prospects and what the pathway is in Congress.
Well, let me just update for the audience. We had today revelation of further evidence of an impeachable offense, namely Mr. Trump conceding that he was lying to federal courts when he said he could not retrieve Diego Garcia, someone who was illegally, by an administrative error, removed to a dungeon in El Salvador, but said he didn't want to retrieve him. Now, prior to that, he had his lawyers go into federal court, say, oh, we're helpless. No, we have no ability to facilitate the return of Diego Garcia, who was illegally removed without any evidence that he was a member of a gang. And I say this because it heightens, I think, the urgency of impeachment when you have a president who no longer feels obligated to represent facts to federal courts. He just makes them up. But that gets me to, I think, the common theme of the impeachable offenses stems from the Article 2 obligation of the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The laws includes not only statutes, the Constitution, but court judgments. And if we go through those that are most egregious, and maybe there aren't any because there's so many, I start out with the fundamental idea of due process. You simply cannot deprive someone of liberty without giving them an opportunity to explain or to refute what allegations the government has made. And the reason why I start out that, Ralph, is we've had an experiment in World War II with what happens when you have no due process. We did that with 120,000 Japanese Americans. No, we just said that they're all likely to commit espionage or sabotage, had to put them in concentration camps. We made 120,000 errors, later apologized for it in 1988. So there's a reason due process is not simply an academic concept. It's essential to preventing these kinds of egregious instances of injustice from happening. And we know that Trump has won. Not only has he removed Abrego Garcia to a dungeon in El Salvador without any due process, but he sent those who allegedly are members of Venezuelan gang outside the country without any due process as well. And there are allegations made, they're terrorists. There's no evidence that they are terrorists. If they wear a tattoo, they're said that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that they must be terrorists. The courts have pushed back against these illegalities, but the idea of an impeachable offense is that you don't have to wait till a president has actually committed a crime. As George Mason said at the Constitutional Convention, attempts to subvert the constitutional order are sufficient to trigger impeachment. It's prophylactic as well as remedial. And these are clear efforts to destroy the entire concept of due process.
Tell us, in terms of not faithfully executing the laws, he's totally wrecking or shutting down whole agencies. Give us the names of some of these agencies.
Yes,
all the firings and the cessation of law enforcement openly.
Yes. The one thing I want to, before I go there, Ralph, let me just explain why. The issue of due process isn't limited to immigration. The rationale that President Trump has given and was noted by a federal court of appeals judge would enable him to deport you, me, anybody on this program, anybody watching this program, and say, well, we made an error. It's too late. We can't help it. So there's no firewall that prevents this violation of due process in immigration context from migrating over to any U.S. citizen for any reason whatsoever. But to go to your larger point, yes, the president has an obligation to faithfully execute the laws that created such agencies as the Voice of America, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Department of Education, the U.S. Agency for International Development. And Mr. Trump has just dismantled all of those. Sometimes he's done it by just telling the staff, you just leave, don't show up for work. Others, he's actually attempted to fire them. Others, he simply stopped spending money. Courts have uniformly said these efforts are arbitrary, capricious, and they blocked him. But the effort is obviously there. He again goes into court and says, we gave individualized consideration, to firing thousands of employees, which they couldn't possibly have done because they don't even have the manpower to do that. Again, it's a very, very severe undermining of the judicial process because we no longer can count on anything from Trump lawyers from being truthful. Now, I practice law regularly in the court system, and there's an unwritten rule that even when you're not under oath, if you're a lawyer, the judge and your opponent expects you to be telling the truth. Now, you cannot rely upon that anymore with the Trump administration, which is another reason why the judicial system is very precarious now, because the Trump people are lying and then they're saying you have to accept our lies as gospel. We won't even let you look at what we're saying is true and proving it false. We'll claim executive privilege or something like that. But going back to the issue of faithful execution of the laws, it's not just shutting down programs. He just decided on day one, I really don't want to shut down TikTok. Even Congress gave it a respite to find a buyer. I'll just decide not to enforce the law against TikTok. Then he decided, I don't really like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I think handicaps us in competing abroad. So we're just not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. There's so many laws that he's already decided he's not going to enforce. It's hard to keep up. And as we discussed earlier, Ralph, with regard to regulations that have been issued by his own administration or previous ones, instead of going through the legal process of revoking the regulations, if you can prove they're unwarranted, he just says, I'm going to tell the agencies, just don't enforce the regulations anymore. This is industrial scale impeachable offenses.
Which is why it's legitimate and accurate to call what he's building as a fascist dictatorship, because he's going after people programs, service programs for people in need, people who have necessities in life unmet, the disabled, the poor, Meals on Wheels, Head Start, consumer protection, exposure to toxic pollutants, worker safety, trying to head off pandemics, trying to do something about climate violence. But there's a whole area which he says, take it over, and that's corporations. He's not going after corporate crime, which is perilously shredding a lot of programs through fraud, from the Defense Department to Medicare. Fraud on Medicare is tens of billions of dollars a year. And he's not going after corporate welfare because he's been a beneficiary, as well as Elon Musk has. and their businesses. He is stopping the prosecutions and the regulatory enforcement against Musk's far-flung corporate empire that were pending under Biden. Those things have been frozen. And he's opening up his own self-enrichment with cryptocurrency deals openly, inviting him to dinner and greasing the wheels, and opening the doors for enriching Musk's corporations from Tesla to SpaceX and Starlink. That's the clinical definition of fascism.
I just point out a couple of things. One, Ralph, the self-enrichment that you pointed out, that's a violation of the Domestic Emoluments Clause. He basically is using the White House to supplement his salary. That's not supposed to happen. You want to make sure the president, and part of this is the power of the purse that Congress has in setting the president's salary, is only receiving compensation from his work as president. And now he gets subsidiary benefits either directly or through his kids who own all these properties and hotels, and all these people who want to lobby and curry favor with Trump. They obviously know they have to patronize all these businesses because he takes a daily look at who's paying the $1,500 per room at the Trump hotels or the golf clubs or things like that. But just the other point you were making, Ralph, about is cutting programs that are really critical to many people's lives. There's a story today. Those workers who were processing black lung disease claims by minors who were almost impossible to be mobile anymore. Trump had fired them all, So the people who are supposed to be benefiting from the government program, at least to provide an offshoot what the companies made when they are mining coal and giving the miners all these horrible lung diseases, he fired all the workers. So, it shows you how cruel and callous this president is.
It also shows that the Democrats and a lot of liberal economists are not keeping up with the horror show that's going on. They don't use words like cruel and vicious. They don't turn Trump's words like deranged, crazed, corrupt on him. They're still using words like authoritarian practices or problematic or distressing or disconcerting or concerning. They're not catching up with the horror show here. That's why Trump continues to have a soliloquy. The Democratic Party now having gatherings to see how are they going to collectively deal with Trump. How does a bank deal with a bank robber? They'll let the bank robber rob the bank and flee with the gold while they deliberate how they're going to deal with a bank robber they see coming into the bank. So how are you going to get your articles of impeachment introduced by a Democratic Party that's this feeble?
Well, it's hard. Al Green, we had discussed earlier, pledged that today was the last day that he had agreed that he was going to submit articles of impeachment. But I haven't seen anything. Unfortunately, tried to engage his office, but it's like talking into a black hole. So you have some people who from one day or another will stand up and say something, but there's no follow-up. There's no consistency here. So how do we get them introduced? Only if the American people take a look at it on my website, on your website, and call into Congress, say, we want those articles introduced. If the American people insist, it will happen. That's how it happened in Watergate. It can happen again, but if you're indolent and passive, it isn't going to happen. They understand only one thing, threat to their office because you're not voting.
Watergate, referring to the Watergate scandal, which is pretty small compared to the impeachable offenses affecting hundreds of millions of people here and abroad by the Trumpster gang. But you do expect that Al Green to soon introduce these articles of impeachment. And you had Jamie Raskin tell you that it would be a good idea to have an informal Democratic hearing in the House on impeachment. And there's probably 2-3 dozen who will sign on, progressive Democrats right at the beginning. And that's the way to get the ball rolling, because what's the only tool left to hold Trump accountable that he doesn't control?
Yeah, it's impeachment. The courts don't interfere. The executive branch has no rule. And that's why the founding fathers thought impeachment, as Ben Franklin said, it's the civilized surrogate for tyrannicide. That's how those are your words used by Ben Franklin. You have a trial, but if you're wrongdoing, it's like firing the CEO. And I keep repeating it like a broken record. There's so much misunderstanding to think that impeachment's like the guillotine in the French Revolution. It's not. It doesn't even come close. It's just like firing a CEO. No one thinks if CEO is fired, that means we have a revolution against July 4th, 1776. So we got to downplay this idea that somehow we're giving up our rights as free people and returning to a bloodshed in the street if you do impeachment. You don't. This is a civilized way. You take evidence, you have an opportunity to respond, and you vote. That's the civilized way in which you deal with wrongdoing.
Okay, let's say some of our interested listeners want a copy of your impeachment articles so they can spread the word back home, summon the members from Congress to a town meeting on impeachment, and send the copies of the impeachment articles to the senators and representatives. Give us your website.
Yeah, so there are two places. One, you could get it on my Substack. That's bruce.fein@substack.com, or at my website, which is www.lawofficesofbrucefein.com. And you can easily download them and send them in.
And it's nothing to stop you, listener, from calling the local office of your member of Congress, which tends to be a little more receptive than the congressional office in Washington, and ask them if they've read these articles of impeachment and whether they're going to take a stand on it. On that note, thank you very much, Bruce Fein, for further enlightening and galvanizing our listeners. And so start talking up impeachment. Use the 22 impeachment articles, listeners. Send them to your members of Congress and demand town meetings on them. There's no better time to start than now, and Trump will keep fueling the fires of impeachable offenses. You can be sure of that. Thank you, Bruce Fein.
Thank you very much, Ralph.
I want to thank our guests again today, Erica Payne and Bruce Fein. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show for you podcast listeners. Stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history. And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody, and join me with reading my new book. After all, I write it to be read. It's called Civic Self-Respect, and it applies to everybody. Very personal, very constructive.